Hello everybody and welcome to Bread Garden Market's Vinophile number 4. We're going to be focusing this particular class on the wines of Spain. In particular, we're going to focus on two very well-known regions in terms of the quality of wines, Rioja and Ribera del Duero. Those are going to be our big two. And as with most classes, we're going to kind of get very specific as we get into those regions, but we're going to start very general with an overview of Spain and Spanish wine. Now, before we kind of dive into it, I do want to, full disclosure, I am a huge fan of anything Spanish. You know, if you're a lover of all things French, you're called a Francophile. Whatever the name is for lover of all things Spanish, that is what I am. Spainophile, Espanophile, I don't know, I'm sure there's a word for it. But I love everything about Spain. It's one of my favorite places in the world. Wine, cheese, the food. I'll talk a little bit more about the food in the cheese video, but in Europe, at least, for the last 20, 30 years, the Spanish have been at the top of the culinary world. They've surpassed France as the greatest European food country in the world, in my opinion. And that's not news. That's been since like the mid to late 90s onward. And the people, the art, the architecture, I can go on for hours and hours just on how much and why I love Spain so much. So if I'm a little more enthusiastic and a little more of like, oh, this is my favorite wine, this is my favorite cheese, this is my favorite food in this video, it's because I'm a little biased. So let's get into Spain in general. Spain has, as a winemaking country, has more acres under vine than any other country in the world, actually. So most grapes planted, most vineyards planted. I think, France is second, Italy is third. They kind of swap back and forth. And then, believe it or not, Turkey is fourth and the US is fifth. But Spain now for a long time has held that kind of status as most acres under vine. They have just a plethora of grape varietals, just like the Italians do. And what's confusing sometimes about Spain, just like in Italy, they have multiple names for the same grape varietal. So, for example, Tempranillo, which is the varietal we're going to be focusing on in this video, has 60 different names in Spain alone. And even within specific regions, they have multiple names. So for example, in Rioja, it's called Tempranillo. Ribera del Duero, which is one of the regions we'll be covering today, they don't call Tempranillo Tempranillo. The local dialect name or dialectical name for Tempranillo is either Tinto de Pas or Tinto Fino. So even in Ribera del Duero, they have two different names for the same grape. So a lot like Italy, Spain as a culture is very driven by region. Country is almost second. It's, I'm from Navarra, I'm from the Basque, I'm from Catalan, I'm from Sevilla, Jerez. So where you come from is more important a lot of times than even the country you're a part of, which is not unheard of in Europe, especially countries like Italy and Spain. And so as a result, you have some of the same grapes and even some of the same cheeses or foods that have regionally different names than kind of their more common name. Spain has been producing wine since before Roman times. So again, like a lot of other parts of Europe, we're talking about a winemaking culture that goes back thousands and thousands of years. Spain has taken a while, like Italy, to catch up in terms of their reputation, I guess, for great winemaking as compared to like France, whereas the French have been known for making great wine since at least the Middle Ages. It has taken Spain a little while to catch up, and that's for a variety of reasons, especially in the 20th century, not the least of which is, up until the late 70s, it was still controlled by Franco, the fascist dictator, which played a huge role in kind of dampening or retarding the growth of food and wine culture in Spain, especially to other parts of the world. But the amount of quality winemaking that has gone on in Spain and the improvements in winemaking from the early 80s to now is phenomenal. It is unheard of. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to Ribera del Duero, because probably no wine region in all of Spain and perhaps the world has come so far in so little time in terms of producing, going from a region that wasn't known for wine, or known for very mediocre wine at the very least, I should say, to a region that produces some of the best wine in the world. We're talking about less than a 40-year time span from when it went from, yeah, this region produces wine, but it's kind of harsh, it's not very good, it's a tannic without fruit, and it's what's going on with this place, to Vega Sicilia, which is one of the most expensive and sought after wines in the world. So as far as Spain's quality of wine has come, there's still a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot of improvement to be made. Spain is still a great country overall for great value. There are kind of new regions of wines being exported all the time to the US that people have never heard of, and that produce excellent wines, whether we're talking about Yecla or Rumilla, places like that. Canary Islands, you still find great value, not as much anymore in Rioja and Ribera del Duero, but still there is a lot of value to be found in Spain. And a lot of these places have been making wine for, again, generations and generations. It's just that the markets outside of Spain, like the US, are kind of recently discovering them. And so again, still a lot of great value can be found in Spain. You just kind of have to know where to look. And it just continues to get better in all regions. So that's kind of a quick overview. Let's get into our two primary regions we're going to be talking about today. Right, so let's get into the big two, or the big two regions that we're going to focus on for our Vinophile video today. We're going to be talking about Rioja and Ribera del Duero, which for me and for a lot of people across the board are the two best wine regions in Spain when it comes for great red wine. Now, there are those who would argue, and they do have an argument, that Priorat should be thrown into that mix as well. Priorat does make some incredible wines. Priorat's range in price point from, $14, $15 up to $300 a bottle. Con la Ermita, for example. And these wines can be magical, they can be fantastic. All respect to Priorat. But I want to choose Rioja and Ribera del Duero because traditionally and most sought after wines in Spain tend to come from those two wine regions. In Rioja, you have Lopez de Heredia, you have Muga, you have Ramirez de Ganutza, and the list goes on, Remiluri, the list goes on and on. In Ribera del Duero, of course, you have Vega Sicilia, one of the most sought after wines in the world. You have Abadía Retuerta, you have Pingus, another huge cult wine. You have Tinto Pesquera, and again, Emilio Moro, the list goes on and on and on. Alion is another one, which is also done by Vega Sicilia. So these are some of the greatest red wines, not only in Spain, but literally in the world. So this is what we want to focus on. Another reason why I chose these two regions as opposed to throwing like a Priorat in there is because the reds for both of these regions are primarily made from the same exact grape, Tempranillo. So again, Tempranillo has a lot of different names. In Rioja, we call it Tempranillo, but in Ribera del Duero, it is known as Tinto de Pais or Tinto Fino, but the same grape essentially. And what's fantastic about comparing these two regions is even though they're made from the same varietal, both probably could not be more different stylistically for the most part. Rioja and a lot of the best Rioja wines when you're talking reservas, Grand Reservas, tend to be fairly elegant, tend to have a lot of secondary flavor characteristics. They tend to be released, not always. There are a lot of producers who still release their wines a lot later, in terms of they'll hold on to the wine in barrel and or bottle for a long amount of time and do not release these wines until they think they're ready to be drunk. There are different varying examples of that in terms of how far these wineries go. For example, on the extreme side of waiting to release the bottles, Lopez de Heredia, which we're gonna have today, waits at least 10 years before they will put or release a bottle to the market. And we'll get into more of that later, but kind of crazy. But they're lighter, more elegant, a little more secondary flavors, and a lot of them release a lot later than most modern day wineries in terms of releasing to the retail market. Ribera del Duero, contrasting, is big, bold, burly, tannic, a lot of dark fruit. They tend to use more oak, or more new oak at least, than Rioja. And the grapes themselves are different because of how they had to adapt to the specific regions of Rioja versus Ribera del Duero. And we'll get more into that a little later when we get into Ribera del Duero. But Ribera's climate is quite a bit different from Rioja. A lot harsher, a lot warmer, and just, it's almost like you're out and just, if you think about spaghetti westerns, which a lot took place in Italy, but some took place in Spain, with kind of this rough, rugged landscape, almost desert-like and rocky, with tumbleweeds kind of blowing through. Ribera del Duero, a lot of Ribera del Duero is like that. So the grape vines have kind of adapted to those climates and have played a part into the style of wine that comes out of Ribera del Duero. But both still, when you break it down, are almost always Tempranillo. Rioja does a little more blending. So although most Rioja reds are made with majority Tempranillo, you can add a little Garnacha. You can add a little bit of a grape called Masuelo. And Garnacha, by the way, is Grenache to most of the rest of the world, including France and the US and Australia and wherever else you want to talk about. So there is usually a little bit of blending sometimes in Rioja, but again, the majority is Tempranillo. Ribera del Duero is almost exclusively Tinto Pais, Tinto de Pais, or Tinto Fino. There is a little bit of Cab and a little bit of Merlot grown in Ribera del Duero, but very small amounts. There is a tiny bit of white grown in Ribera del Duero, but I don't think any of it makes it into the U.S. market at all. That it's less than 1%. It's an incredibly small amount of white grapes planted in Ribera del Duero. So we're talking strong Tempranillo-based wines. So what's interesting to me about this comparison is that we're talking about two regions that are not that far apart from each other, and also that use the same varietal but produce vastly different wines. So now let's get into the regions a little bit and get a little more specific, and then start drinking some wine. And now to dive into Riojas. One of my favorite wine regions in the world, one of the best wine regions in the world for both reds and whites. We're not going to get into the whites today, but there are some incredible white wines that come out of Rioja. But today we're focusing on the reds. So let's first talk a little bit about the history of Rioja. Rioja to this day is still sometimes called the Bordeaux of Spain, somewhat fairly and a little bit unfairly. I mean, it takes away from some of the uniqueness of the wines of Rioja, and they are very unique and in a lot of ways very different from Bordeaux. But the French did have a lot of influence on Spanish winemaking, especially in that region. Rioja was part of a passage in the Middle Ages. There was a famous pilgrimage that hundreds of thousands of Europeans made every year to a shrine for St. James the Apostle. And pilgrimages, of course, were hugely popular in the Middle Ages, where you visit holy relics or holy places or holy burial sites. among Catholics and Christians in general. And if you were traveling from France or Italy, but France specifically, to this shrine of St. James, this very famous shrine, the road went directly through Rioja. So the France would pass on their knowledge of winemaking to the people of Rioja while they were passing through the region. And many French winemakers invested in land in Rioja and began to make their own wines. There are still a number of well-known Rioja producers who were originally owned by Bordelais, people from Bordeaux. So you had that influence in the Middle Ages. And then a couple centuries later, as we get into, or depending upon what part of the Middle Ages we're talking about, centuries later in the 1850s and 1860s, phylloxera hits France. And phylloxera is a terrible disease that wipes out vines and send the wine economies of Europe into shambles, destroyed them essentially for a period of time before they learned how to graft resistant vine stocks onto other vines. But phylloxera didn't hit Europe at the same time. So in 1850, 1860s, where phylloxera is attacking Spain, or France, excuse me, it has not yet come to Spain. So what happens? Spanish wine becomes incredibly popular. You get a lot of French migrants, French winemaking migrants, who move from France to Spain, specifically Rioja, and there's a wine boom in Spain, and there's a wine boom specifically in Rioja that lasts a good 40 to 50 years. But unfortunately, phylloxera eventually, after it wiped out France, and French vineyards, I should say, not France, that would be strange, wiped out French vineyards, it eventually moved into Spain. And by 1901, 1902, phylloxera was in full effect in Spain and destroyed and wiped out most of the vineyards in Spain. And specifically, certainly, Rioja was the hardest hit. And the wine economy in Spain just fell apart and really didn't recover until the 1980s. You saw some signs of relief in the 70s and then the 80s. And why did it take so long? Well, if you think about the 20th century in Spain, it is not a very happy one for the most part. You had World War I that occurred obviously in the early 20th century, 1914, 1918. You had a Great Depression, and then World War II. And while Spain was not directly involved in World War II, there was a very famous Spanish, or infamous, I should say, Spanish Civil War that took place right before World War II. And while Spain remained neutral, the result of the Spanish Civil War is that the fascist Franco, specifically Franco and his supporters, the fascist sector of Spanish government took over. And they took over up until the 1970s. And there was a number of great famines in Spain throughout Franco's rule. And so Franco ordered a lot of the vineyards to be torn up and to be replanted with wheat to help feed the populace. So many of the vineyards were destroyed even after World War II. So Spanish wine industry, the Spanish wine industry and Spanish winemaking in general really doesn't recover until the 1980s, after the fascist government is no more. But as I mentioned in the earlier part of the video, the renaissance, the rebirth of Spanish wine and the quality of Spanish wine that's taken place over the last 40 and 50 years is extraordinary. The amount of quality that came out after such a short period of time is really amazing and almost unprecedented. Italy had a similar renaissance, but still not nearly to the extremes of going from just a wine market and a wine economy and wine culture that was in shambles to a thriving, ever-improving, fantastic wine culture and economy that we see today in Spain. So that's a little bit of the history. Spain itself, depending upon how deep you want to dive into the region, can be fairly complex, but not nearly as complex as certain places in France and Italy. In fact, on the surface, Rioja is a a pretty, again, on the surface, a pretty easy wine region to understand. You have three major subregions within Rioja. You have the most well-known, Rioja Alta. Rioja Alta is where the most well-known Spanish wineries in Rioja are. Muga, CVNE, Cuney, Lopez de Heredia. There is a very, very famous winery called La Rioja Alta, which is located in Rioja Alta. Sierra Cantabria. So all of those are located in Rioja Alta. And so generally that's considered the best winemaking region in Rioja. And then you have Rioja Alavesa, which is a little further east than Alta, which is considered part of the Basque Country. Also incredible wines that come out of there, not as many imported or exported to the US. And then Rioja Baja, which is south and east of Rioja Alta and Alavesa, I think in and around Navarra. Also great wine, tends to be a little more everyday, rustic drinking wine, but all three regions produce excellent wine, Alta, Alavesa, and Baja, but Alta is the most well-known, and deservedly so. I left a map in the information packets I sent you, and you kind of see how they're divided. And like a lot of great Spanish wine regions, the region is kind of cut by a river, the Ebro River, and then when we get to Ribera del Duero, we'll talk a little bit more about the river that splits that particular region. So that's a little bit about Rioja, the basic regions. Now in terms of the wines, like I said, both white and red, mostly red, but I urge you to search out some of the whites. They are also extraordinary. But Rioja has primarily made the red wines from Tempranillo. They can blend a little Garnacha, a little Mazuelo, and a little Graciano. So there can be up to 3 other varietals in there besides Tempranillo, but Tempranillo, for something to be classified as Rioja, is always the, well, 95% of the time, the majority of the varietal that is used in a particular red wine. Rioja does have a Rioja does have a specific classification system in terms of how long a wine is aged at a minimum, and it is a kind of labeling system that is still very much used to this day. There are a few exceptions, some of them outstanding wines, but most wineries in Rioja use this basic labeling method. So if it's from Rioja and it could say Crianza on it, it could say Reserva, it could say Gran Reserva, and each of those classifications means something very, very specific. So if it's a Crianza wine from Rioja, it'll say Crianza on the label. It has to be aged a minimum of 2 years before release. So 1 year has to be in barrel at least, and 1 year in bottle. If it's labeled Reserva, it has to be a minimum of 3 years aged before release. Again, 1 year minimum in wood, 2 years minimum in bottle. And then if it's Gran Reserva, it has to be aged a minimum of 5 years, 2 of which have to be in barrel, and 3 of which have to be in bottle at a minimum. So your basic classifications are Crianza, Reserva, Gran Reserva. The age requirements are 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Now you get some labeled Joven, or what's the other? They're just referring to a specific year of vintage and don't have aging requirements, but nothing we're going to be dealing with here today has those other kind of minor labels. We're going to be talking about specifically Reserva in this class, or in this video. That basic aging, that basic labeling system does become a little complicated because those are minimums. I mentioned earlier there are a number of wineries in Rioja that age for a lot longer than that. So our first wine is an example of that. It's the Lopez de Heredia. It is one of the most famous wineries in all of Rioja. And you can see this is labeled Reserva. So this is a Lopez de Heredia Viña Tondonia. Tondonia refers to the vineyard. They have 3 vineyard sites. Tondonia is one of the vineyards. And this is a Reserva. So by law, by Spanish winemaking law, it has to be aged a minimum of 3 years. The people at Lopez Heredia, though, don't release any of their reds, and their whites for that matter, for at least 10 years past vintage date. So this is a 2008 vintage, and it is not 2021. This is the current release of Tondonia. So this wine they didn't release, it's a Reserva. It's been aging in barrel for a number of years and in bottle for 13 years before, well, I guess technically 2020. So 12 years before they released this. So the 3 years is a minimum. There are wineries like Lopez de Heredia, although they are the best, in my opinion, that will wait at least 10 years before they release their reds into the market. So the aging is the guideline, not a requirement. Once you get past the 3 years, you can still put Reserva on it. And so the other complication in Rioja, or kind of, there are, you know, we had talked about in other countries like Italy, there is this little kind of tug between traditionalist and New World producers. So you have people like Lopez de Heredia who make very classic, aged, elegant style Tempranillos that focus on a lot of secondary flavors, secondary characteristics. There are newer style producers like Ramirez de Ganuza, for example, or even Muga, although Muga kind of splits the difference depending upon what wine you're talking about, who will release their wines a lot younger. Their wines do tend to be a little more modern in the sense of they're a lot oakier, they're a lot more tannic in structure, they're a lot bigger wines. So another kind of weird complication in Rioja, and not weird in a bad way, just in terms of what is a Rioja like, what styles are most Riojas. Well, if we're talking about traditionalists, we're talking about elegance, we're talking about secondary flavors, we're talking about super aromatic versus more modern winemakers who make big, burly, dark fruit, tannic structured wines. Both make wines that are very age-worthy, whether you're talking about traditionalists or you're talking about modern winemakers. Like I said, this is the current release of the Tondonia. We're talking about a wine that was bottled in 2000, or barreled, excuse me, and bottled in 2008, and is now 2021. So that's enough about Rioja for now. We can keep going on and on about the region, but let's actually start getting into the wine. After all this talking, I definitely need a drink. So let's talk about our first wine. Lopez de Heredia, Viña Tondonia Reserva, 2008. So Lopez de Heredia has been around for at least, 130, 140 years, I think. They haven't changed much of their winemaking style since that time. You know, I have never been lucky enough to have been there, but I know people who have, and I've read about people who have read articles from people who have visited there. And by all accounts, visiting Lopez de Heredia is kind of like stepping through time into a past that really doesn't exist anymore. You know, that's not to say they don't use some modern winemaking techniques, but very little has changed in over 130 years. And Lopez de Heredia is one of the most venerable, well-respected wineries, not only in all of Spain, but the world. There's very few wineries that I find are fawned over as much as Lopez de Heredia. I mean, people go crazy for their wines. And they're sought out, and you know, there was a time I would almost call them a cult wine, but they've almost gotten too popular to be called cult wines anymore. But their wines are just incredible. And like I said, the tradition of the winery is to not release the wine until they think it's ready to drink. So this is not something you need to lay down for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They release the wines because they think it is ready to go. Now, that doesn't mean they can't age more, and I would say this wine can age another 5, 6, 10 years pretty easily, but we already have 13 years of age on this wine. It's softened, you're getting a lot of secondary characteristics. So basically, this is called the Vinofiles Reserva. They also make, I think I said they have three, I meant three other vineyards. So there are four vineyards, four very prized vineyards that Lopez de Heredia has. The Tondonia, the Cubillo, the Basconia, and the Zaconia. I always kind of forget about the Zaconia. So besides the Tondonia, there are three other vineyards that Lopez de Heredia have and use to make their wines, and that's it. So we are talking about the Tondonia. The average age of the vines is 45 years old. Some older, some a little younger, but on average about 45 years old. If you've never had any of these wines before, you're in for a treat. The wines are always highly lauded. I think this 2008 Tondonia, if you're into ratings, has like 97, 96 points. Believe it or not, their white wines are sought after more than their red wines by collectors around the world. And I mean, you can't argue the white wines are, in some cases, more incredible than the red wines. They're very different though. They have like this really oxidized, unique kind of flavor to them, the white wines I'm talking about. But I encourage you to seek those out. We get some of the whites at Bread Garden sometimes, twice a year maybe if we're lucky. The reds are a little more easily accessible, but not much. We'll have these wines maybe a half a dozen times a year, the reds, the Tondonia, if that. So if you kind of look at the wine when you're drinking it, and like I said, feel free to drink this wine. This is not something that you need to cellar. You can, but it's already kind of fading a little bit in color, not as dark ruby. You get more kind of brick, and then kind of just starting, not quite there yet, but starting to get into a rusted color on the rims. And you definitely get like a lot of herb, like herbaceousness, a little smokiness, floral. There's still some nice fruit there, like plum and cherry. That's awesome. That is awesome. So this has been sitting in my glass for about an hour and a half since I started talking. And I've had a number of cuts through this video. So it's been sitting in the glass, and it's, ooh, let it sit out. Even if you drink it now, even though it's 13 years old, decant it, let it just sit in your glass. I get, like if you've had Old Bordeaux, this is kind of what, this is why people call Rioja the Bordeaux of Spain. Although again, that kind of takes away from their own identity. But man, this is smoky and tobacco, and you get some of that herbaceousness on the palate. The fruit's still there, but it leans a little bit more towards a secondary flavor. I do get some cherry and plum, almost licorice. Ah, this is good. Nice finish. There's still some tannin on the finish though. I mean, I think this will still age for a bit while, but there's really no reason to if you don't want to. I mean, just jump right in. Oh man. So I would just drink this by itself in terms of what to pair it with. In Rioja, they have a lot of rustic, simple cuisine. Interesting about Spain, one of the interesting things about Spain is the best wine regions don't always correlate with the best cheese and food regions necessarily. The food in Rioja is fantastic, but it's definitely more rustic, more game driven, and that would go well. Like this would be fantastic with squab or quail or duck, maybe some venison. I would go softer just because of the age. This is not something I would pair with a big meaty ribeye or strip. I wouldn't do this with lamb necessarily. It's just a little too light, a little too elegant for that type of, so I would go kind of game fowl. I left a little quote from Neil Martin, who was a pretty famous wine critic a number of years back, who wrote for the Wine Advocate, Robert Parker's Wine Advocate. And he had a whole, I talked about how people just fawn and go crazy over this winery, over this vineyard, over this Lopez de Heredia. Just read that quote I put into the information packet, because you'll get a sense of how crazy people go over these wines. And you would think he was talking about like some mystical place from Arthurian legend when the way he talks about Lopez de Heredia. But many people, including myself, feel this way about these wines. And I had mentioned in the recent emails I sent about the next set of wine clubs for the next 3 months, and how this particular one, the Spanish one, might be the best wines you get all year from the Vinofiles Wine Club. And this is half of the reason why. These wines are amazing. Lopez de Heredia is just incredible. And we're gonna have a wine next that might even top it. So enjoy. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. These are incredible wines, and salute. Now to jump into our second great red winemaking region in Spain, Ribera del Duero. So Ribera del Duero is a vastly different wine region than Rioja. It is the landscape we're talking about, like in terms of where we are in Spain, the high plateaus. We're talking about 2 hours north of Madrid. We're talking about a very rugged, arid region. In fact, the river that runs through it, the Duero, which is where the region gets its name from, Ribera del Duero, is the only reason why you're able to grow grapes in this region at all. It's probably the only reason why that region is not just a desert wasteland. And while the river itself is not very deep or not very long or wide, it gives the climate just enough to make it where you can grow grapes. And not only just grapes, but fantastic grapes. I mean, this is the weird juxtaposition of where this region is located. The climate and the river give you almost perfect conditions for making incredible red wines. And the climate is very, very hot during the day, especially during the summer months, and very cool at night. So again, the extreme in temperatures are ideal for almost any winemaking region we've talked about so far with these classes and with these wine clubs. And Ribera del Duero has that in spades. And if you ever get lucky enough to go to one of these great wineries in Ribera del Duero, the harsh climate is reflected in the vineyards and how the vines themselves look. I mean, it looks like the vines struggle, and you want vines to struggle in winemaking regions. They're twisted, they're gnarled, they look like they just are barely hanging on. The earth itself is like barely clasping onto these vines. And that's ideal for winemaking. If you're making like Smucker's jam, you don't want to plant vineyards in Ribera del Duero. If you're trying to make world-class wine, it is the perfect location. They don't produce the vines, don't produce a lot of clusters. There's very few clusters that are produced on each vine, but again, that's what you want, because the less clusters you have, the more intensity to each of those clusters. All of the vine's energy goes into those few grape clusters on the vines, as opposed to being spread out. And how the grapes look. So we're talking Tempranillo, again, in Ribera del Duero, Tinta de Pais or Tinta Fino, but it's Tempranillo. But because of the harsh climate of Ribera del Duero, how Tempranillo grapes look in Ribera versus how they look in Rioja are also night and day. Ribera del Duero Tempranillo or Tinta de Pais, very small berries, very thick skins. The grapes have adapted to the harsh climates in which they are grown. So with the smaller berries, with the thicker skins, you have a vastly different style of wine. So very generally speaking, the wines of Ribera del Duero, the reds, are going to be much more tannic, much more structured, just bigger wines in general than the wines you get from Rioja. And a lot of that has to do with climate. Some of that has to do with the aging and the winemaking process, sure. But at the very base level, you're always going to get, without manipulation, more tannic structured wines in Ribera del Duero than you will in Rioja. That doesn't make them better. That doesn't even necessarily mean they'll age better. You're just getting a different wine stylistically. And so that is no more apparent than the wine we're going to have here in a second, the Flor de Pingas. Before we get to the Flor de Pingas, I want to talk a little more about the history of Ribera del Duero. We talked about how Spain struggled throughout the 20th century with making quality wine. Ribera del Duero was viewed up until through the mid to late 70s as a winemaking region of mediocrity. Even a winemaking region that produced harsh, almost unpalatable wines. And even more so than Rioja, there's probably no region in all of Spain that has come so far so quickly in terms of making these incredible wines than Ribera del Duero. And there's really two wineries that are responsible for this incredible resurgence of great winemaking in Ribera del Duero. And that is Vega Sicilia and Tinto Pesquera. And these two wineries, although there are plenty of other wineries that existed along with those two and before even those two wineries existed, they pushed Ribera del Duero into the next stratosphere of quality wines. And they both still produce incredible wines to this day. Vega Sicilia is very famous. It's one of the most sought after wines in the world. Their Unico wine is $1,000 a bottle on a retail shelf now upon release. They make another wine called Valbuena, which we actually carry, which you could find is usually more around 200, 225. But these are big cult wines that are sought after throughout the world. And I think in like 81, Vega Sicilia had this landmark wine vintage that put them on the map. And Tinto Pesquera is a wine that is a little more affordable for the most part, but just produces killer wines. And what these two wineries did was push other wine regions, and other wineries around them, not wine regions, other wineries around them to do what they did. How did they get so good so quick? Vega Sicilia and Tinto Pesquera both invested a lot of money in modernizing their winery, replanting their vineyards, and just kind of studying and experimenting and using all types of different techniques to make incredible wines. They uprooted a lot of the vineyards, replanted, brought in new barrels, aged wines in state-of-the-art facilities, and as a result, a lot of wineries around them began to copy their methods. And you had the birth of all these other wineries, or rebirth, I should say, that improved their qualitative levels exponentially. Emilio Moro, Abadia Retuerta, just incredible wines nowadays that 30, 40 years ago that were considered meh, all because of Vega Sicilia and Tinto Pesquera. And there was a third winery that came about in the mid-90s that pushed Ribera into even a further stratosphere of greatness. You kind of had a second rebirth, so to speak, that launched a whole bunch of other wineries, and that is, of course, Pingas. Now, Pingas, kind of along the same lines with Vega Sicilia, Tinto Pesquera, but came much later and was part of this new wave of wineries that kind of cropped up again. So you have this kind of, in Ribera del Duero, so you have this kind of rebirth with Vega Sicilia and Tinto Pesquera. And you have wineries like Emilio Moro and the Barrio Tuerta that are inspired by this and increase their quality as well. And then you have kind of a second surge of fantastic wines that come out of Ribera del Duero that happens kind of in the mid-90s. And the leader of that movement was a guy named Peter Sissek. Peter Sissek is a Danish-born but Bordeaux-trained winemaker who came to Spain and Ribera del Duero in the mid-90s and opened up Pingus and had his first vintage, I believe, in 1995. And then you had this kind of second crop of fantastic Ribera wines like Maro, M-A-U-R-O, not to be confused with Emilio Moro, and others who had the second crest of incredible winemaking. And so we're going to focus today, obviously, on Pingus because our wine is from the Pingus winery. And Pingus became, like Vega Sicilia, this cult phenomenon. And he went from making one of Spain's, Peter Sissek went from making one of Spain's best wines in the mid to late 90s to making one of the world's best wines. And Pingus quickly became one of the most sought after wines in all of Spain and indeed all of the world. And they just make two wines there. They make Pingus and then they make Flor de Pingus. If you notice, Ribera del Duero, I should mention, does have the same basic aging system, labeling system that Rioja has in terms of Reserva, or excuse me, Crianza, Reserva, and Gran Reserva. And it's almost the same. It's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years again, same amount of time in barrel for each level. But in Ribera del Duero, they don't, some wineries use that labeling system, some don't. Pingus does not, or at least Flor de Pingus, if you notice on the label, you will not see Crianza, Reserva, or Gran Reserva on the back. You'll see Coseca, which is a label you will see sometimes on Rioja wines and Ribera del Duero wines, but Coseca just means vintage or year. So that's just talking about the year it was produced. So Pingus, newer, more modern winemaking style, don't adhere to some of those labeling, which is fine. They can still call themselves Ribera del Duero. Flor de Pingus is often called the little sister of Pingus. Pingus, again, Pingus goes for, I think at this point, over $1,000 a bottle as well. Flor de Pingus is very expensive, but not nearly at that price point. But Flor de Pingus is not, it's its own wine. To call Flor de Pingus the little sister of Pingus is a little insulting. And it's not even a second wine. It's kind of its own, it's its own masterpiece. It's its own painting. It's its own, you know, whatever you want to call it. It's its own wine in its own right. Pingus and Flor de Pingus are fairly different in style, but Flor de Pingus is just a masterpiece. I have an incredible fondness for Flor de Pingus. It's one of the first Spanish wines I discovered when I first started working in the wine industry over 20 years ago now. It was one of the first wines that I had that made me fall in love with Spanish wines. It's also one of the first wines I started to collect and put in my cellar. My cellar now is not what it used to be. I've gone through most of my cellar, but I usually get a couple bottles of Flor de Pingus every year and put it down in my cellar just because it's so great and it ages really well. I'm not gonna drink this Flor de Pingus with you. I've had it twice already, and I have a bottle at home in my cellar. I will tell you, it's incredible. I would give this, the 2018, I would give this wine 10, 15, even 20 years if you wanted. I tasted it when it first came into the store, I guess maybe about a month or two ago now, probably about a month and a half. And it was just as good as I remembered, if not more so. I haven't had it in, man, it's probably been 3 or 4 years since I've had it, just because I hadn't found it in Iowa. I hadn't found a distributor who had carried it. But it's big. It's much bigger than the Lopez de Heredia. It's a massive wine. It's got a lot of structure, a lot of tannin, but underneath that tannin, There is just loads of dark fruit. There's a little earth. There is a good amount of oak on it as well. And then there's just crazy like soy and Worcester and umami to it. It's got this savoriness to it that's just incredible. It is going to be an amazing, amazing wine, but be patient with it. You could drink it now, you'll be very satisfied, but it's so tight right now, it's so structured that you really will not give it its due. Sit it down for at least 5 years. If you don't believe me, buy a second bottle at the store and taste one, and then you're gonna be like, okay, I should have laid it down. But, you know, how do you tell if a wine is kind of tannic and structured and a little closed off? How do you know what it's gonna be like in the future? You know, there is some guesswork that's involved with all these writers and so-called wine experts, but, you know, it's an educated guess. And in this case, with the Flor de Pingus, a very educated guess. It's the kind of notes you get underneath all that tannin and oak and structure. And this thing is so layered and so massive. You know, in 2031, 2032, it's going to be absolutely magical. So this is something I would drink with lamb, with kind of a New York strip, with a very protein-heavy drink, or excuse me, protein-heavy meal. But it's an unbelievable wine. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Please have patience, or if you don't have patience, at least get yourself 2 or 3 bottles so you could drink it over a 1-year period, 5-year period, and 10-year period. But wait, it's a phenomenal wine. And whenever you do enjoy it, enjoy, and remember where you got it from. I hope you enjoyed. That's the class. It's 2 wines, but like I said, it's maybe the 2 best wines you'll get all year from these clubs. I cannot speak highly enough about both of these vineyards, both of these winemakers. The Lopez de Heredia, drink now. Flor de Pingus, try to hold off, but I'd be interested to hear what people think of the Lopez de Heredia. So please let me know in the comments below, or when you come in to see me, what you thought of the wines. I always like feedback, and enjoy.